Hi, so today I will be discussing an essay plan which I developed for an artist of the floating world in relation to Module B of the Advanced English HSC syllabus. So the question that we will be using today is, how is the interplay of memory and guilt central to the shaping of characters in an artist of the floating world? Before we go into the actual essay structure, let's discuss the context. So this is a piece of historical fiction which depicts the tumultuous period of post-World War Japan, which of course is the floating world that's referenced in the title. And this considers the impact of the cultural conflict between traditionalism and modernization and how that shaped Japan's society at the time. Now, the first paragraph should focus on the narration of this text, as that is integral to us understanding the themes of it. So we know that Ono is quite an unreliable narrator, and this relates to the question because he does reconstruct memory in order to acquit himself of guilt, and we'll go into how he does that. So the first point we want to focus on is that Ono is an unreliable narrator, so you need to establish that with a quote where he essentially humble brags, because that is quite a weird thing to do in the sense that no one really goes, oh yes, I never think about how amazing I am, but every time I just happen to walk out, there's people like falling to my feet, telling me how amazing and significant I am to society. Come on. So in that sense, we just want to establish, yes, he's unreliable because he has a tendency to try to persuade that he's modest despite being of a high status. And we then want to demonstrate that he has a tendency to manipulate reality in order to favor himself and acquit himself of guilt. Because when we just establish that he's unreliable, he just sounds like someone with a bit of a superiority complex in that sense. But we want to show how manipulative his intentions are in terms of like persuading us that he is free of guilt instead of actually accepting his role in the way things are played out. And a great example of that is the betrayal of Kuroda, when he essentially dobs him into the police for his anti-imperialist views. And when his art is burned, he goes, I'm not accountable for this, I was just fulfilling my duty, even though like most characters in the book look at him as if he's done a horrible thing, which he has in a sense. And so once you've established that Ono is unreliable and that he does reconstruct memory in order to portray himself in a positive light, we then want to focus on the generational conflict that's present in this text. Now, this manifests in two ways: in the relationship between him and his family members who are younger than him, as well as that relationship between him and just younger generations in terms of like the men that fought in World War II. So let's start with the first point. So first we want to talk about his dissonance with his family, which we can see with him disapproving his grandson's modernization, specifically the fact that he contradicts his granddad's cultural perceptions relating to Japanese traditionalism, and instead of doing things that his grandfather kind of approves of, he would prefer to play Cowboys and just like subscribe to American culture, which directly contradicts the things that Ono values in life. And in the same sense, we want to then follow that up with looking at how imperialist elders were expected to be held accountable for their actions because they didn't physically fight in the war just because of their age and like the filial piety or respect that they expected, and instead they control like legions of soldiers who are of course younger members of Japanese society. And so we know that as a result of the psychological and physical trauma of World War II, these younger generations then want retribution, and they definitely feel a huge sense of anger at seeing these elders returning to society as normal and not truly understanding the consequences of their actions by kind of subscribing to like imperialism. And we also see that specifically in like the symbolism of the burning pleasure district, which Ono states wasn't necessarily damaged by the bombs that detonated during the war, but they were still in a huge state of disarray, which is then later implied to be like these younger men destroying nationalistic symbols of like traditionalist Japan because of the negative consequences it had on their lives and their perceptions of society. And then we want to follow that up with paragraph 3. Now, this is going to focus specifically on Ono's art. So we know there is like a bit of a conflict there between like his imperialism or nationalistic views and an artist's general purpose of like developing a specific aestheticism or like style that is reflective of the individualism and will thus become significant in time. So the first point you should focus on is how he decides to become an artist despite his father's rejection of it due to like the traditional connotation that any sort of art or humanitarian role is essentially unworthy of society because it isn't necessarily as promising in terms of money and status, and there are other ventures that are more worthy of respect. So in that sense, this reflects his need to be an individual and to kind of produce art that he thinks is going to be significant in terms of the impact it'll have on people around him. He wants to be a mover and shaker in that sense. Now, then we need to contradict this with the fact he's not able to reach his goal. He does not become, even though he's respected due to his like age and status in a way, he is unable to be a relevant artist with a true legacy because his art is just based on fleeting commercial and political trends. There's nothing quite significant or transcendent about his work. I would argue that's because he's a huge narcissist that is unable to truly comprehend the nature of reality around him, and he is too focused on these imperialistic and nationalistic views that he's been exposed to that he can't truly comprehend human nature or the reality of post-World War II Japan. And we can see that in how he has a tendency to hide his art and act like, oh, yes, no, I'll put them away for now, which is his own way of suppressing his guilt and shame, and again, reconstructing memory in a way to go, oh, yes, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily have art to show his significance, but his significance is reflected to the respect of the people around him, which in itself we can sometimes see might be exaggerated by him due to his unreliable narration, as we mentioned in paragraph 1. So those are the 3 main paragraphs I would recommend for this essay. So first, establish his nature as an unreliable narrator, and this reflects the question because he reconstructs memory in order to acquit himself of guilt. Then follow that up with paragraph 2, depicting the generational conflict between traditionalism and modernization, especially in the context of post-World War II Japan, because this exemplifies how the suppression of memory and guilt reflects the perpetuation of imperialist values in that sense, or specifically all the generations' inability to kind of adapt to change. And in that sense, paragraph 3 is linked to the question because Ono's conflict between that need for individualism and his need to adhere to nationalism also reflects his suppression of guilt in a way, but not guilt specifically to society, but to himself and the goals that he wanted when he was a young child, and his life purpose of establishing himself as a relevant artist. And despite having some level of status or respect, he doesn't have a legacy necessarily because his work is not transcendent. It is quite superficial and it is limited to commercial and political trends that don't have true value to society in terms of like having a lasting impact on people's perception of the time. So in that sense, that's how those 3 paragraphs link to that question relating to the interplay of memory and guilt. Now, in terms of adapting this essay draft to other questions, the question we're going to be using as an example is how is characterization used in Ishiguro's An Artist of the Floating World to explore stagnation and renewal? So again, you can see there's a commonality between both questions in terms of the characterization. So the shaping of characters, and then we say the how is characterization used, right? And we specifically see this in the characterization of Ono and his unreliable narration, as well as the values of modernized youths in post-World War II Japan. So in terms of this question, exploring stagnation and renewal, the traditionalist elders with imperialistic views represent stagnation, as they are unable to adapt to the changes brought about by society post-World War II, and they're unable to accept the consequences of their actions due to their authority as elders during that war and the negative effects it had on the younger generation. Now, this younger generation represents renewal, as they respond to the psychological and physical damage brought about by the war, by essentially rejecting imperialism and nationalism, because they saw what the negative effects of that was on them and around them. So they pushed towards establishing a society free from its influence, and they even subscribe to more Americanized views that prompt individualism and seeking a sense of purpose that is not constrained to just what is that phrase? That essentially is not just limited to satisfying your role for your country. So in a way, establishing a society that's not just based on making your government or your elders happy. So truly seeking individualism. So what you would do for this essay is you would adapt the topic sentences of your paragraphs to have key words from that question, as well as make sure the first word of your introduction addresses the question, again, uses keywords from it. So for paragraph 1, instead of talking about memory and acquitting himself of guilt, we're going to talk about how the unreliable narration is his response to the uncomfortable urge to renew society and his inability to overcome that stagnation of spiritual and physical identity. And then for paragraph 2, we can link this to, again, the stagnation of the traditionalist elders who can't see beyond the limitations of their values, and the renewal that's being pushed by these youths, specifically his grandson's Americanized values, as well as the younger generation holding the imperious elders accountable, which completely contradicts that concept of filial piety, which explains unrestrained authority and acceptance of an elder's opinions just because they were considered authority figures in the complete sense of that word. And then for the third paragraph, you can link that to his initial need for renewal, because it's a constant urge for renewal that he's looking for as he jumps from one art trend to another and one teacher to the next. And then the stagnation, as he essentially comes to a point when he realizes his work is not significant because he was just recycling these trends and just trying to produce works that satisfy the imperialistic and nationalistic values of Japan at the time, as opposed to really looking at human nature and creating a work that was lasting in terms of legacy. So those are the ways you would adapt the main concepts of those paragraphs to that new question. Now, I hope that was helpful. And again, I will also provide a link to this document, which you can use as a reference, and there will be some quotations added just so you guys have something as a basis to help build these ideas on. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Enjoy writing your essays.